Hi, my name is Anessa Marie, and I am a composer and music director based in New York City. I'm the founder of the Phoenix Trans Chorus of NYC and also the resident music director for Trans Voices Trans Cabaret. In today's workshop, we'll discuss ways that we can begin to create a more inclusive environment for TGNC actors when working in the musical theater. We'll discuss the language we use in the audition and rehearsal rooms, how to talk about the voice in a non-gendered way, and how to prepare materials to be as inclusive as possible. We'll also get into some specifics that we don't normally talk about, like binding and other ways the voice can be affected for those who do choose to medically transition. Thanks for joining and doing your part to create a more inclusive environment for everyone. Hi, everyone. Thank you all for being here. I'm so excited to talk to you just about working with TGNC people, specifically in musical theater. I think it's such an important conversation that we don't have enough. And so I'm really just happy to be here to share with you. I'm happy you're all here. I do just want to set just a couple quick expectations just of the space. Because I want this to feel like a safe space for everyone who's here today, whether you identify on the TGNC spectrum or you identify as a cisgender person or anywhere else you may fall. I want you to feel like this is a space where you can ask questions. I'm seeing it is super dark. Let me see if I can get a little more light. That might help. But like I said, I want this to feel like a space where you can ask whatever questions may feel uncomfortable, that you may not have ever had the chance to ask because you may not know someone who identifies as TGNC, or it's just been uncomfortable. That being said, I also just want to reserve the right, if a question is too personal, to pass on that. But I'm a pretty open person, so I don't think we will run into that problem. So I wanted to start just by sharing a little bit about me as a human and a musician. I grew up in West Virginia. I moved to New York City about 7 years ago. And I work in New York City as a music director, a composer, and orchestrator. And I would say about 85% of the work that I get called to do is involving TGNC individuals of some type, in some way. I work with Trans Voices Trans Cabaret, which is a bi-monthly presentation where we provide a space for trans actors to perform who don't get that opportunity. I'm also currently founding a trans choir in New York City made up specifically of TGNC individuals. And so in doing that, I've done a lot of research. To further educate myself, even though I am a transgender woman, I'm always learning too. So it can be a scary conversation, but again, this is a safe space. So I want to jump in. I have a keynote I'm going to share while I talk. So let me get that going. Is that showing for everyone? Yeah, cool. So we're talking about creating an environment of inclusivity, and I want to just start with why this is important. If we look at theater, the history of theater, it has always been a binary thing, where we identify people as male or female in general. We're starting now to see a shift in theater to include stories not only about, but including TGNC individuals in the ensembles of theater productions, in leading roles, and everywhere in between. One of the biggest examples of this that I can think of is Peppermint in Head Over Heels, who a few years ago, she was the first transgender woman to originate a principal role in a Broadway production. We also saw A Strange Loop with L. Morgan Lee. We're seeing in TV and film more TGNC people coming into the spotlight. In preparation for this class, I interviewed 57 TGNC people who are working actors in theater in some capacity. And the comments that they had on the industry as a whole, it was amazing to me just how similar they all were. Even though everybody's journey as a TGNC individual is different. Through theater, I believe we can begin to normalize the TGNC experience by representing it on stage to people who don't experience this in everyday life. We can do that through the direct inclusion of TGNC individuals. We can also do that by advocating for these individuals to be hired behind the scenes as well, and being allies. One of the biggest things that stuck out to me and resounded in my conversations with the population was that marginalized folks always have two jobs in the rooms that they walk into. The first is the job that they were hired to do. And then the second is the job of surviving that job. You know, in the world, TGNC people, we put up with a lot of crap. And that can be really, really scary when we walk into a space where we're being creative and we're asked to be the most vulnerable so we can get to the authentic truth of the material we're working on. So I'm so excited to talk about this. So let's go into it. So creating a safe space, just the way that I've structured this class, we're gonna start with some general thoughts, and then we'll get into some specifics regarding physicality, changing voices, what that looks like, and how we can best approach that in a rehearsal room and throughout our process as both composers and music directors. So the first step is humanity, just being human, being respectful. I think we all just inherently do this as artists, but it's something we have to keep in mind. Recognizing that there is a difference between what our intention is and what the impact is of what we do. We can have the best of intentions, but if something comes up in the room that makes it feel unsafe for an individual and impacts that individual in a way that is different than what our intention was, we have to own that, right? Going along with that, allow yourself to make mistakes, own them, and move on, because no one is perfect. You know, one of the biggest things that people worry about is misgendering a TGNC person. It happens. It's something we, of course, try to avoid, but I will say I have made the mistake. But the important thing when it happens in the space you are in is that you own it, you apologize, and you move on, and you grow forward. I love the idea of growing forward, and you'll hear that a lot today in this conversation. Creating a safe space, be willing to be an ally. Be open to challenging both yourself and others to be more inclusive in everything that we're doing. You never know, you may be the only person in the room who has had the opportunity to talk about this and to learn about this. And you can advocate in whatever position you're in. And we'll get more into how to do that. Being flexible in your approach to musical theater is super, super important. when you're working with TGNC individuals. For me, as a music director in these spaces, a lot of the times I will walk in and the level of training that people have, the level of experience people have is so vastly different because TGNC people, a lot of the time, we're not cast in roles. We don't have the opportunity to be on stage to gain the experience. So you may be working with someone who has only performed in a cabaret setting once in New York City in 3 years. And this is the very first time that they're getting the opportunity to actually do the work that they have been wanting to do for so long. So as musicians, music directors, composers, we are problem solvers. And we have to be creative and flexible in our approach in doing so. The other thing I think that's important to note is considering intersectionality. With the TGNC population in general, we see TGNC people who are also in the BIPOC category. That's very different than my experience as a trans woman who happens to be white, because I don't deal with the other side of things. So really, learning about humanity in general is a great thing to do when you know you're going to walk into a space, specifically where TGNC people are existing and asking for a safe space to create. Thinking forward, it is the best way to be an ally. You want to educate yourself to the best of your ability. The more you understand, the more you can advocate and be an ally in the room for people. One of the biggest things you'll hear in conversation with TGNC actors is that we walk into rooms and we are expected to not only do the job of the actor, but we're also expected to be a dramaturg, to be thinking about the representation that is happening on stage, to be giving notes on the script, to be fixing language. There are so many things that just are inherently expected when you are TGNC and walk into a space where you're especially creating new work, that anything you can do to take a little bit of that load off of the TGNC community is helpful. And it includes, research, knowing the terminology, being able to look at language and recognize if things could be problematic, being able to ask those questions, and not doing it just when you're in the space, thinking about that ahead of time to lighten the load. Thinking about the physical space that you're providing for individuals, for auditions, rehearsals, recording sessions. Are they inclusive? One of the biggest things to think about are the bathrooms. Are there gender neutral bathrooms that are available for TGNC people to use? Thinking about dressing rooms in the space, even as a musician, you can just bring up these things in a production meeting to the stage manager just to get it on the radar. Thinking about the people in the room, I have worked with many different sized budgets. And we don't always have the resources to do so. But specifically, if you're working on a TGNC piece, there are gender consultants that are now almost becoming the norm. when you're working with TGNC people. So thinking about, is there a budget to bring in someone who keeps an eye on this, who can just be that advocate for the TGNC community when you're in the space? Do you have the ability to hire an associate music director? Suggest, you know, an associate director, choreographer, whatever it may be, who identifies on the TGNC spectrum. So many times, TGNC individuals walk into the room and they immediately notice that they are the only TGNC person there. And it's scary. It's so scary. You know, we're always told, and I know I tell actors this, you have to leave your stuff at the door and come into the space with a fresh mind. I believe in that, but with the TGNC community, it can be really, really hard, right? We look at the world we're living in right now, where the TGNC community is under attack, you know. Rights are in question that are basic human rights that everyone else has, that they don't even have to think about, but it's always in the mind of TGNC people. So just having someone else in the room, I can't tell you how many times I've been in an audition room as a pianist when a TGNC person walks into audition and they see me and they smile because they're not the only one there. And it's the same way in the rehearsal room, in any space that you're in. Always introduce yourself with your name and pronouns is the other thing. I advocate for this, even if you're in a space where you may think it is completely cisgender. It may not be. You never know. You can never assume what someone's identity is by looking at them. So I always advocate, unless you're in a space where you really know the people that are in the room, that you're always introducing with your name and your pronouns and asking other people for theirs. I think it's also a way to just bring attention to the importance of this for people who may not ever think that this should be a thing. And then never making assumptions, right? One of the biggest things that I've heard from TGNC individuals is when they walk into a space, immediately they're labeled. They're labeled as androgynous for the way they look. They're labeled as not masculine enough, not feminine enough. You never know what someone's capabilities are. You never know what they've been through, where they are in their transition, in just their personal life. It's something I think we should do as humans anyway, but specifically thinking forward about this with the TGNC community is super, super important. And I want to get into the physical side of things. Just leading off of that, we're gonna get a little uncomfortable. This is something we don't talk about, but it directly affects our work, specifically as music directors and composers, just the physical side of transitioning for TGNC people. I do want to start this by saying never ask someone about their physical transition. You would never walk up to someone who identifies as cisgender and ask them about their body. It's not something you would bring up, so don't bring it up with TGNC people. It happens so often in rooms. I've been in rooms where I've just been mortified by the things that I've heard. Rather, you want to provide a safe space where people feel comfortable to share with you, but don't expect them to out themselves or talk openly about their transition, whatever that means to them. Remember that no one's physical transition is the same. I think there's an assumption with the TGNC population for people who don't quite understand it, that everyone wants to go on hormones. Everyone wants to have surgery. It's not the case. You know, I have trans women friends who have no desire to physically transition in any way. The same on the other side of the spectrum. And then you also have the in-between with non-binary people who take various different approaches to making themselves comfortable and addressing whatever dysphoria that they may feel. And this goes directly back to assumptions. We can never assume. Going with the physical side of things, I think it's really important when we're working specifically with singers to recognize that both dysphoria and trauma happen. With the TGNC population, trauma is higher in occurrence of many different types than the cisgender population. The one thing we know about trauma is that it lives with us, right? It lives in our psyche, and then that also translates into our physical life. So one of the things I've experienced a lot as a music director working in this capacity is breath support fails a lot of the time. We have to figure out ways to kind of retrain the voice, or train the voice if someone doesn't have training to where they're actually supporting properly, where they can kind of release the body and just let whatever needs to happen to create sound. For people that do choose to medically transition and decide that that is the right thing for them, hormone therapy does have effects on both the trans feminine side and the trans masculine side, though it does affect the trans masculine side in a greater capacity. So I want to talk about that. And to talk about that, we have to understand how the larynx works. It's also known as the voice box, and it is the structure in the neck, which is made out of cartilage that forms the scaffolding for the vocal cords. If we think of this like the strings of a guitar, so you compare the high E string with the low E string. The lower E string is thicker than the higher string, which gives it a rounder, richer tone. If you put your finger on a fret and pluck, you're essentially raising the tone by making the strings shorter. And this is an easy way to think about how the larynx works for those of us who may not know. With hormone therapy, it affects the body in many ways, right? So we may see changes in vocal range, whether that's the pitch raising or lowering. I've seen it happen both ways, though with the trans mass population who choose to take testosterone, generally that's where we're going to see the biggest difference. With changes in vocal range, we have to be flexible in the process, right? Especially if someone is at the beginning of their transition and has just started testosterone, we may go through the rehearsal period and see things kind of shift. So we have to be ready to creatively problem solve when that happens. We also see changes in timbre Specifically, the size and shape of the chest cavity can change. I know for myself as a trans woman, when things started changing here, when I was on hormone therapy, it affected my timbre. It affected my breast support, and I started noticing I was sounding more nasal. I was not as connected as I was before I decided to medically transition. So I really had to focus on retraining that side of things for myself. We also noticed register changes where the break falls shifts. And it can shift really, really drastically. I've seen cases where I've seen an octave shift in where the break falls. And that affects not only the writing of a piece, it can affect the music direction of a piece and just making sure we're still getting the sound that we need. I've seen breaks move and then move again years later. You never know what's going to happen. It's not an exact science, just like, you know, puberty when you go through it as an adolescent. So singers do become more prone to cracking and squeaking, and we have to be ready to solve those issues. This is where I think it's really important as a music director that you're in constant communication with the composer. If you're working on a new piece involving TGNC people, that way you know kind of in advance what adjustments can be made to the material to make it easier. Vocal fatigue also happens. Specifically for changing voices. In the TGNC community, what used to be easy can feel like a chore. You know, someone who may have been belting C's, all of a sudden is just so tired, even from doing it once or twice in a day. That can be potentially dangerous, right? And as music directors working in theater, we have to be ready to adjust and to coach that, or maybe plan for, plan to bring in like a voice coach. Sorry, I don't know what's happening. Plan to bring in a voice coach who actually deals with that, if that is something that you're not comfortable doing as a music director. I want to get into a little bit more specifics about the trans male voice too, because specifically with testosterone, we see some different things that happen. So over time, if someone is on testosterone therapy, the vocal folds get longer and thicker, but the larynx remains the same in size. And this can actually prevent the vocal folds from growing as large as they might in a person who went through a typical assigned male at birth puberty. It also hardens the cartilage and makes the larynx less flexible, which can possibly lead to other problems. Specifically, the biggest problem that we see with this is something called entrapped vocality. What entrapped vocality is, the voice sounds permanently weak and hoarse, which can create some detrimental problems for singers. We can work through this. A lot of the times we can improve it through daily exercises. A lot of the time when I work with trans masked people who are experiencing this problem, I give them breathing exercises to do, starting with them exhaling soundlessly for 5 minutes. and making sure they're really breathing using the diaphragm, trying to retrain those muscles. I'll then go into like rhythmic breathing exercises with some harder consonants. So S and Z are ones that I'll use a lot. For the exhale, with improvised patterns. And I will ask my trans mask cast members when I'm working on a show to do this before coming to rehearsal. Because it really just gets their breath ready for a group warm-up, which I will always do with a TGNC cast, just to make sure everything is flowing before we actually start singing. Generally, when you look at the trans feminine population who choose to go on estrogen therapy, we're not going to see hugely drastic changes like we will see with trans mask individuals. However, a lot of trans feminine people will go through voice therapy just to make them feel more comfortable and lead to a more cis comparable speaking voice, which can then affect their singing voice. And we have to creatively problem solve that as well. When we talk about the voice with trans people, we want to make sure that we're not talking about things in a super gendered way, right? I have been in rooms where someone, the biggest example that comes to mind was someone who actually said to a trans male, can you do that again, but can you sound more manly when you do it? And it just baffled me because it automatically invalidated their experience as a human. And it goes right back to humanity. We would never say that to a cis person. So why would we say it to someone who identifies on the TGNC spectrum? I want to move into just some more specifics of our day-to-day world. Oh, actually, one more thing we have to talk about. Binding. This is something in the trans mask population. And I think it was in the glossary that was sent out before the class as well. But a lot of trans mask people choose to bind. And what that is compressing the chest area, right? To just create a look that is more typically male. Often as humans, we diminish that which we don't want seen. With binding, I will run into trans mask individuals who won't even take full breaths because it accents this area. And so we have to troubleshoot, how can we get them breathing in a way that is both healthy and also is comfortable for them? Again, remember, every person is different. Don't ask questions directly related to the body. But keep in mind that all of these things can affect breath support and just can affect the singing voice in general. And also remembering we hold trauma in our bodies. And this is when I think it's specifically important to get a voice coach involved, if we don't feel comfortable with this. So we're not doing more damage, but we are providing support to the individuals in the room. So talking about our process now, I want to talk about the audition room. Again, we start with humanity. When we're in the audition room, we want to make sure we're taking time to acknowledge people's pronouns, providing our own. I feel like auditions often go so quickly that we forget we're actually humans interacting with each other. And I think this is a problem with the industry as a whole, but specifically when you're casting TGNC individuals who are scared to even walk into a room. We have to think about the language we're using. I've worked with casting directors who immediately when someone walks in, it's hello, sir, or hello, ma'am. Again, making assumptions based on what someone is presenting as. And when you're a TGNC person and you walk in and your identity is automatically invalidated, there's no way you can possibly do your best work and really show what you're capable of. I encourage everyone to be open to considering non-traditional casting. There are some cases, it's not always going to be appropriate, right? But when it is, be open to seeing TGNC people. When you send out an audition notice, indicate if you're open to that. If you're using language in an audition notice, know what language you're using. Too often I see audition notices go out where we're seeking to cast a trans feminine person and they're actually looking for someone who identifies as trans masc, but they just don't know the language to use. And this is where educating yourself becomes so important. Appointments can be helpful with TGNC individuals. One of the biggest resounding things about the audition process when I was speaking with my friends was that they avoid open calls. Because open calls, a lot of the time, especially if it's an ECC, you know, they're gendered, just in who is actually coming. Hearing from TGNC individuals who have gone to open calls, they walk into a room and then they feel like they have to give headshot and resume, and then also an essay about why they're even there. So especially if you're looking specifically to fill a TGNC role, I think appointments are super, super helpful. Look at someone's resume when they walk into a room. TGNC people, for the most part, are now putting their pronouns on their resume. So if you're unsure, you have a reference and you can make sure you are using the right language when referring to them. When you're in an audition, I always check the range of performers, especially if I know I may end up casting them, because that makes my process as a music director moving forward so much easier when working with the TGNC population. So prepping for your first day of rehearsal. If you know the vocal ranges of the individuals in your cast, great. You can prepare the score to be more inclusive. Talking about scoring, I typically avoid scoring anything in SATB formation. There's a lot of debate on voice assignments, and specifically regarding SATB. I used to be of the mindset that these are not gendered terms. until very recently, I was working with a group of, I think it was 10 to 15-year-old people who identify on the TGNC spectrum. And I mentioned soprano, alto, tenor, bass, and they were mortified because they immediately said, this is gendered language. And I didn't quite understand. And then I thought about the historical connotations. You know, we grow up in choir, soprano, alto, women, tenor, bass, men. That's how I was taught to look at music. But we've seen a shift in the world. We're seeing a shift in the way we approach things, and we have to adjust for that. When possible, what I will actually do if I'm involved in prepping the score or even talking with the composer or music assistant, if I have that luxury, is to just include the actor names on whatever line I want them to be singing. It involves a little bit more prep, but it makes the space feel better. Prepping, I always prepare transpositions when I'm working with TGNC individuals. I'm not a good sight transposer. If you are, great. If I'm gonna be behind the piano, I need to be able to see what I'm looking at, what I'm playing. Very often, I will walk into a space and the key that I have a song in originally is not the key that is right for the singer. So if I'm not able to walk in with, like, you know, a song in 7 different keys, I will ask the composer to send me the finale file, send me the Sibelius file. And then I have my computer with me. I can just go right in rehearsal, hit the transpose button, super easy. I might play it off my screen until we can get it printed, but at least I am ready to go. If it's a new piece in your prep work, I always make sure that I'm communicating with the composer and that I'm talking with the composer about everything that I've mentioned so far. Because not only do I have to be aware as the music director, the composer has to be aware. It's their piece. And my job as a music director is to honor that while getting the best possible product. To do that, changes have to be made, especially if the composer isn't in the room. You want to have a very clear idea before you walk into that first day of rehearsal of what changes are acceptable, what are not, and then what you actually need to check in about. The other thing that I'll do is if it is a TGNC heavy piece, I recently did a reading of a new show by Kit Yan and Melissa Lee that had a transgender woman in the starring role who sang almost every song. So even before that first day of rehearsal, I was in contact with that actor. We were talking about range. I even met with the actor to kind of figure out where the voice was going to sit the best. This was super important because it was a 29-hour read. So we were super limited on time. And I was able to walk in just more prepared in general. Like I said, there's a lot of debate currently surrounding typical voice assignments because they do have gendered connotations. Be creative with this. We get to be innovative and imagine what the world could be. I always say create the world that you want to see. With voice parts, there are no limitations to how creative we can be. I let kind of dividing these up be a fun part of the process. You know, depending on the age group, I've used top, middle, bottom, which younger, kids find funny. There was also a group of kids that I worked with, and they decided instead of soprano, alto, tenor, bass, they were going to be squirrels, aardvarks. There was a tea animal, I think it was tigers, and then bassoons for whatever reason. But it's okay to have fun. I've also labeled things A, B, C, D, E, F, G. There are many different ways we can do this without the typical SATB formation. Again, it goes back to being human. I think too often as musicians, we worry about being musically correct. I totally appreciate that, but the creative approach is more fun. Yeah. So the first day of rehearsal, I always start with introductions, including pronouns. It immediately sets you up for success. I also advocate when working with specifically TGNC casts that this happens at the beginning of every day. There are people that I know who, some days pronouns are he, some days pronouns are she, some days it's ze. And the fact that they are in flux is something that we want to remember so we can be the most inclusive possible. Again, you might mess up pronouns, apologize, move on, it's okay. Identify yourself as an ally for every actor in the room without singling out the TGNC community. As a creative, you're there to create the best work possible. If you're advocating for everyone, it helps to avoid the idea of tokenization and singling out traditionally marginalized individuals in the room. Time allowing, on the first day of rehearsal, I always get to know the voices that are in the room. I love using group warm-ups for this. I'll start a group warm-up on the piano if I don't have a pianist. If I have a pianist, they're playing, and I walk around the room, specifically getting close enough to where I can hear individual voices. A lot of the times with the TGNC population, the voice is one of the first, for lack of a better term, tells that we are trans. So it can be really scary in a new room to sing or to even speak. When you're doing a group warm-up, people are generally gonna be more comfortable than jumping right into, music rehearsal where we're learning something new. And you can also hear where people are just automatically placing their voices, which gives you a big clue as to where they're most comfortable. First day of rehearsal, I always have pad as well while I'm doing this, so I can write down people's ranges. So then that night I can go home, review my plan for the score, dividing up parts, and adjust accordingly. And then in continuing the process throughout the rehearsal period, be an ally. Be human, respect identity, listen, learn, grow, make mistakes, own your mistakes and move forward. Also know who is creating arts involving TGNC actors. Who are the TGNC composers? Who are the TGNC actors that are coming into the room and trying to be a part of this work? And who is the future of the art form? Again, ask questions, listen, learn, and grow forward. And then create art that matters. That's what we do. It's why we do what we do. Art can change the world. And yeah, that's what I have for you today. It's a topic to cover, but I do want to open the floor to any questions that people may have. Jamie, are you there?
Yes, I'm here. Hi.
Hi, do we have questions?
We do, yes. So the first question is, if you are in a long-term workshop process of a piece and the composer or music director wants to cater or adjust the vocal demands of the role for a TGNC actor going through a transition, what would be the best way to initiate and continue the conversation?
With the actor or?
Yes.
With the actor, I think especially if it's long-term, I know for a lot of the long-term projects that I've been on, we've had the same actors in the room over and over. If you have a relationship with the actor, I think it's okay, you know, to sit them down and just be really, really honest. You know, we're thinking about adjusting these things. How do you feel about that? I think it's a good way to start the dialogue, and then you can start to make adjustments from there based on the response that you get. Just with human conversation, yeah.
Great. Next question is, do you have more examples of vocal exercises that MDs can use to help TGNC talent navigate their voice?
I do. I have really specific breathing exercises that I'm actually going to send out as part of, I have, right now it's at 11 pages, but it's just a document of resources that's going to go out to everyone that's here. So those will all be there, yeah.
Love that, okay, great. How can an MD, when trying to discern an issue with breath support, determine if binding is the cause or what the cause is and help with that?
That's a complicated question. You know, ideally, as TGNC individuals, we know what is causing our issues, right? I'm a big advocate that TGNC individuals know their body so well. You know, I think what ultimately what I would hope is that a TGNC actor, if breath support is an issue, we really are trying to explore what is causing that, right? Starting with an open conversation, you know, I notice that, you know, your breath isn't connecting. You know, what do you think you're having trouble with? That can start to open up a conversation because you're not talking about the body specifically. You're talking about the actual problem, right? So I think in any situation where there may be something physical related to TGNC, we want to talk about the problem and not what we think the cause might be.
That makes sense.
And then get creative from there.
Great. And then the next question is, how do you test ranges in the room? Literally a series of ahs or something else? Do you have any specific patterns, exercises, or questions to ask?
One of the biggest things that I find specifically with the TGNC population is having them sing on a V. For whatever reason, that tends to just automatically connect things for a lot of people. And you can really get an idea of where the capabilities lie.
Great. What are your recommendations for thinking about understudies and replacements, especially when you were talking about parts being labeled using actor names?
Specifically, I think it depends. If you're looking at a lead role, there's the option of having different keys for understudies. You know, you look at Dear Evan Hansen, there was the key for the main player, and then there's an understudy key that is in the score. You know, it gets trickier when you're, you know, looking at ensemble tracks. For me, when I'm working with TGNC individuals in the ensemble, looking at understudies, I will try to cast someone who is comparable. It's not always possible. When it's not possible, I will meet with understudies to find ways that we can kind of make it work, right? While still keeping the integrity of the show. I'll involve the composer in that conversation. You know, are you okay with this adjustment? Is it then going to be exactly the same as if the regular player was on? Probably not. For me, that's okay. If everyone else on the team is on board with that, great. If they're not, I will let them know, you know, why I think it's important. And that's where I think it really goes back to being an advocate, being human.
Oh, there's a great comment from Georgia. She says, with the Broadway show 13, they had several keys for many of the songs because they acknowledged that the teens' voices were changing. So why can't we do that for everything?
Yeah, that's for, I think there are songs that have 3 different keys. Like, ridiculous. And great.
Next question. When it comes to having TGNC voices represented on TGNC stories, if there's a TGNC musical in development, would you rather be approached as a writer being asked to join the writing team like a composer or lyricist, or as a consultant? Like, which would be better?
I think as a writer, I think it's really, really important that when we're writing TGNC material, there are TGNC people involved in creating that. Too often, we see cisgender white men writing about a trans woman's experience, and what they write about is the physical transition or the I'm so sad side of things, you know, and we're people, like, we're happy. I'm generally a really happy person, and I don't see a lot of happy TGNC people represented at this point. So I want to tell that story.
Yeah. What expertise do you expect from a voice teacher who works specifically with the TGNC community?
Specifically, I think vocal pedagogy degree is super important. There, you know, I have tips and tricks that I use as a music director. If the problems are manageable in the rehearsal room. But as a music director working with TGNC individuals, I also recognize when it's not something that I can fix in the rehearsal room. I don't have a vocal pedagogy degree. You know, I understand it to the extent that I do, but as a music director, I have to think about longevity for performers and keeping them safe. Specifically with TGNC people, you'll find with their range changing, they're trying to navigate that while also navigating, you know, how do I just be human and be okay with where my voice is at? And that's where I think someone with vocal pedagogy can really address that to the best ability.
Okay, I think we have time for one more before Georgia comes in with our 2 o'clock spiel. Advice for working with a singer who is pre-transition or early transition, whose singing range may cause them dysphoria.
This comes up a lot for me. Specifically with trans feminine people, I, you know, will work with trans feminine people who are trying to sing way up in their falsetto, and they're just not supporting it properly. They're not using the proper technique to do that without hurting themselves. For me as a TGNC individual, I can talk about things in a different way, right? So I will directly, you know, address that and be like, you know, you might want to consider studying with someone who can help you navigate that. You know, I've also run into TGNC individuals who think their range is somewhere where it's not. And that's just a fact. And that's where, again, I think just going back to this creating a safe space, keeping open communication, and just being respectful to where they feel comfortable enough with you to have that conversation is important. Humanity.
Humanity. We're going to keep asking a few more questions, but it is 2 o'clock, and I know there are always people who have to leave right at 2 o'clock, and so I want to make sure I get to speak to them and to all of you and say thank you for being here and for joining us. Jamie has just reposted the links if you feel so compelled to make a donation to Maestra. It allows us to keep doing these workshops as we move into planning our fall season. I also want to let you know we have 2 more classes this week. Tomorrow is everything about the French horn with Kira Sims, and then Thursday is all about the bass. I probably don't have the titles exactly right, but it's all about the bass with Marianne McSweeney. And we have a super important meeting that we're doing in conjunction with the Musicians Union on Wednesday night at 5 p.m. Eastern Time, which is called the Pass the Mic. This is the end of a 3-part series about Black women musicians telling their stories and their experiences, what it has been like to be a Black woman in a space that often does not have room for them. And so they have had 2 meetings already that were just for them to build community, and this meeting on Wednesday is open to everyone. So everyone of all genders, all races, all ages, all everything. It's going to be specific to musicians and music lovers. So if you, that's all on our Eventbrite page. If you want to register and join us for that, we'd love to have you there. Otherwise, thanks for being here, and I hope I get to see you again later this week.
And I'll just remind everybody that you can save the chat right there by where you write the messages. There is a little box with 3 dots in it, and if you click it, it gives you an option to save the chat. There's been a lot of great resources put in the chat. It also, I'll just also point out that the link to all of our classes so far is in there amongst our donate links as well. So the access to where all of the classes are also. So Anessa, if you're good to continue with questions a little bit longer, there are some questions left. So the next question is, how are people including pronouns with their slates during auditions?
With their slates, I will literally just see TGNC people come into the room, and literally when they introduce themselves, it's, hi, I'm Anessa, my pronouns are she, her, hers. And I think it's such a regular thing for the TGNC community that we're so used to doing, that even if I'm in a space where, you know, everyone else has introduced themselves and then I introduce myself, is something I automatically do. And I encourage everyone to kind of go that route, even if you're cisgender, because again, you can never assume.
Great. In the glossary, you mentioned that gender nonconforming is an outdated label. Should we avoid using that? Isn't that part of the term TGNC?
It honestly, for me, it depends on who you are talking to. In general, the language surrounding TGNC individuals, we're learning more and more every day. The glossary that I sent you, I guarantee you, you will go in there in a month and 5 of the terms will be outdated, because this language is always evolving. This is where I follow organizations like PFLAG, like the Trevor Project, who specifically focus on the language surrounding TGNC individuals and provide updated resources. I think gender nonconforming, it's starting to be outdated. It's still a term that we hear a lot. However, if you hear from someone that they don't like that term, then respect that and don't use it with them. But you know, it goes so many ways. You know, there's another side of things where we as TGNC individuals, we're reclaiming some of the language that was outdated and was considered offensive. But again, it depends on the individual.
Yeah. Okay, great. My follow-up question was going to be like, where can we follow? Where can we look to stay updated ourselves as the language is constantly changing? And you mentioned PFLAG and the Trevor Project. Are there others?
Keep an eye out for the resources that I'm going to send out because I have a huge list. Yeah.
Great. And then this next question falls into the same category, which is books and literature that you recommend that we can read to do more research into working with TGNC singers.
There was a book mentioned in the chat that I highly recommend. It's by Liz Jackson-Hearns and Brian Kramer, and it's The Singing Teacher's Guide to Transgender Voices. It's a brilliant, brilliant resource. And I have again, the resources I'm gonna send out, there's more reading. And then there are a couple of documentaries as well that have addressed this issue that I'll send out as well.
That's excellent. And then do you know how to best work with someone who would like to start singing in a range that is associated with their gender identity, but not their current range?
I think being realistic with expectations is important. I know specifically for me, when I started to transition, I hoped so much that my voice was going to raise an octave. It didn't happen. But I had a really, really good teacher who I was working with who was cisgender, but felt like a safe space, who, when I started working with them, we just had realistic expectations in place, where I was more prepared for what actually ended up happening with my voice and my body. For me, it was having that respect from someone for my voice the way it was mattered to me and made a difference in my life, because I didn't feel like I had to change it, and I felt like it was okay with where it was. So I think it goes back to humanity, and then just really being honest and realistic in what can happen.
Our next question is a can of worms. What is your personal opinion on if Broadway should be doing shows featuring cis men who act as women in a way that isn't drag performance or a trans experience, like Mrs. Doubtfire, Tootsie, etc.?
My personal opinion is honestly an unpopular opinion in the trans community. You know, Tootsie specifically came under a lot of fire when that show came out for being transphobic. I personally saw Tootsie, and the monologue at the end of the show that Santino delivered as Dorothy was all about acceptance and all about meeting people where they are. That's the type of art that I love and appreciate. There's a great documentary that kind of addresses this question. It came out on Netflix recently called Disclosure. And it talks more about Hollywood, but it specifically addresses the idea of men in dresses and how when that first started, it's been around since, you know, 1920s, where that was a funny thing. I think intention is important, and that is it being done to make fun? Can it be construed that way? It's a loaded question. You know, I look at like La Cage aux Folles, I look at Priscilla, where, you know, Bernadette was a trans character who was played by a cis white male. So I think also, who is telling these stories? You know, are we actually casting roles appropriately? and allowing transgender people to be in the shoes of transgender characters on stage, because that absolutely matters.
Great. And then this was a public question in the chat, but I'm just going to bring it up just to get your opinion on this as well, about if there's a way to have AEA require ECCs to be less gendered, because appointments are a great solution for TGNC people to be seen, but how do we get performers in the TGNC community that don't have the representation or privilege of knowing those on the creative team to be seen or even get into the audition room?
I think AEA is a good place to go for that. I also think it starts with casting directors who are actually bringing people into the room, who are actually contacting and dealing with the submissions that are coming in. You know, I see so often my TGNC friends, they'll submit for roles and then they never hear back. They don't even get like a thank you for submitting, anything like that. And you know, I know not every casting office does that, most in fact don't. But if we're actually going to get TGNC people into the room, it starts with the casting directors. I see Hadestown is being mentioned in the chat. Hadestown is actually a great example of a team that did that, and a team that is fighting for more representation of BIPOC people, of the TGNC population. The team at Stuart Whitley casting agency, and I wish other casting agencies would look at them and kind of take their example and follow it.
And do you have any vocal coach recommendations for pre-transition trans mask performers?
I do. That also, I have a list in the resources. I keep saying I'm going to send these resources out, and I will. But I have a list of, there are vocal teachers that work specifically with trans mask, and then specifically with trans feminine individuals as well, that could be helpful. Yeah.
That's so great. And that is actually the end of my list of questions. So everyone else here, speak now or forever hold your peace. And other than that, I'm just going to say, Anessa, thank you so much. This has been so great and so informative. And thank you for putting yourself out there and being willing to answer uncomfortable questions, being willing to just like share all of your knowledge with us. It's been so wonderful, and we are all better for it.
Thank you, everyone, for coming.
Thank you, Anessa, and thank you, Jamie, for hosting. But especially thank you, Anessa. This was really, really wonderful, and we're so lucky to have you in our community.
Thank you.